warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to tonight's episode of the Daily Debate. I'm your host, Nancy Sarah Barakat. Up for discussion, we're going to be taking a look at the latest developments in Syria and Iraq, where fierce fighting and airstrikes broke the third day of a four-day unilateral Russian ceasefire in the divided Syrian city of Aleppo on Saturday. Russia has been announcing daily that it will abide by the next day of the series of daytime ceasefires, which it said it called to allow civilians and rebels to leave the besieged city, but no announcement has yet been made. However, rebels, for their part, do not accept the ceasefire, which they say does nothing to alleviate the situation of those who choose to remain in the rebel-held eastern Aleppo and believe it is part of a government policy to purge cities of political opponents. The Syrian army and Russia had called on residents and rebels in eastern Aleppo to leave through designated corridors and depart for other insurgent-held districts under a promise of safe travel, but very few rebels or civilians appeared to have left. For his part, France's foreign minister urged the international community to do everything to end the massacre in the Syrian city of Aleppo, while the U.S. Defense Chief Ashton Carter said that an operation to isolate Daesh in Syria's Raqqa should begin in conjunction with an assault on the insurgents' Iraqi bastion of Mosul. We're also going to be taking a look at what's happening in Iraq, where the government forces have actually entered the last settlement on the northern approaches of Mosul. Army units launched an offensive at the settlement of Tel Kayef, the so-called Daesh capital. The ground military operation to liberate Mosul in the neighbor governorate started in the morning of October the 17th. Nearly 60,000 troops are taking part in the operation, including government forces, anti-terrorist units, police forces, Peshmerga forces and Al-Shahd al-Sha'bi militia. The ground operation is supported from the air by the US-led coalition as well as Iraqi aviation. Now, according to intelligence data, there are currently up to 6,000 Daesh terrorists located in Mosul. So how do my guests evaluate the situation in both countries? How do they see the international efforts to put an end to the bloodshed? When are these offensives expected to come to an end? And what results will they bring? That and much more will be discussed later on in the programme and in depth. But as always, we like to bring you some other stories making headlines here in the country. And we start off with President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who ordered on Saturday increased security at vital facilities after a high-ranking army officer was shot dead on the outskirts of Cairo earlier in the day. During a meeting with top government officials led by Prime Minister Sharif Ismail, President el-Sisi said that Egypt would not forget the sacrifices made by the martyrs of the nation from both the armed forces and police. Earlier on Saturday, military Brigadier General Adil Ragai, an armoured division commander in Dahshur, was shot dead by unknown assailants in front of his house on the outskirts of Cairo. Our second top story, and Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry said during a press conference with his Spanish counterpart, who was on a visit to Cairo, that there is no conflict between Egypt and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia over Egypt's vote in a UN resolution on the Syrian civil conflict. Now, Shoukry said that a draft resolution on Syria is currently being reviewed by Egypt, Spain, as well as New Zealand, where the three countries look to make the humanitarian situation in Syria a priority. The draft resolution will focus on the provision of humanitarian aid to Syrian civilians and will stress the importance of putting an end to the fighting through a political solution between the Syrian factions. Shoukry added that Egypt hopes to see a balanced resolution passed which involves discussions between the international community and Arab partners in order to save the Syrian people from terrorist organizations as well as foreign military interventions. Now with us over the phone to tell us more about this and for his insights, Ambassador Hussein Halidi, former Assistant Foreign Minister. Thank you very much for your time. Ambassador Hussein?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much for your time, sir. Let me start off by asking you, obviously, how you see Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry's statements over Syria and Egypt's role as well, or Egypt's new role, if you will, in the Syrian conflict?
Well, I guess the good news is that Egypt and Spain and New Zealand are working on a draft resolution to be put before the Security Council of the United Nations concerning the situation in Syria, particularly the delivery of humanitarian aid to the besieged zones in Syria and especially in eastern Aleppo. And I guess this is one of the main points of this agreement with Saudi Arabia, and I hope by this draft resolution, and let's hope that the Security Council would adopt it, we could overcome the latest disagreement with Riyadh over the Egyptian voting in the Security Council on the Russian draft resolution.
Right. Well, you say that, Ambassador Hussein, but the foreign minister said that there was no disagreement between Egypt and Saudi Arabia over Egypt's vote on the UN resolution. I mean...
Well, that's on record. We have the statement, the explanation of vote by the Saudi permanent representative to the UN in New York, and he publicly called Egypt to task after we voted for the Russian resolution.
Right.
So, but anyhow, we are doing our best in Cairo to overcome any impression that relations with Saudi Arabia are strained, and that's the main message that we would like to send to the Saudis.
Just finally, Ambassador Hussein, let me ask you, Egypt, Spain, as well as New Zealand, why these three particular countries, do you think, and what can they bring to the table?
Well, I guess Spain on behalf of the European Union, Egypt on behalf of the Arab world and the African countries, and New Zealand on behalf of the English-speaking countries,
right?
Working together on a draft resolution, the wording of which would encourage every member in the Security Council, including the permanent members, to vote for the draft.
Okay, and I thank you very much for your insights, Ambassador Hussein Halidi, former Assistant Foreign Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, our first report for the evening, and a closer look, first of all, at the latest from Syria.
Fierce clashes and airstrikes resumed in Aleppo on Saturday after a three-day unilateral Russian ceasefire expired, as the Kremlin vowed to liberate Syria of terrorists. Russia implemented a ceasefire in Aleppo on Thursday that was extended to Saturday in what it said was intended to allow civilians and rebels fighters to evacuate from the eastern part of the city under siege since July. The UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said airstrikes resumed on Saturday as gunfire and artillery exchanges intensified along the front lines. Citing a lack of security guarantees, the United Nations said it was unable to provide aid to the rebel-held parts of the city or evacuate civilians during the three-day ceasefire. Rebels did not agree to the ceasefire, which they said failed to provide assurances rebels or civilians would not be arrested, and did not allow for humanitarian aid to reach those in besieged areas. The Syrian regime had set up 8 corridors under a plan that would have involved the UN bringing rebels and civilians to rebel-controlled Idlib province, Turkey, or areas under control of Turkish-backed rebels in northern Aleppo province. Russia and Syria accused the rebels of blocking civilians from leaving and preparing an offensive to break the siege. They say their forces are targeting Al-Qaeda-linked Fatah al-Sham Front, formerly known as Al-Nusra Front. The opposition accuses Russia and Syria of targeting civilians in a brutal offensive to retake Aleppo that has killed at least 500 people and wounded another 2,000 in September. No outside aid has reached the city since July. and stocks of basic necessities are running low. Talks between the United States and Russia in recent months have focused on providing humanitarian aid and on separating Al-Qaeda-linked groups from the so-called moderate opposition backed by the West, Turkey and Gulf Arab states. Speaking in a televised interview on Saturday, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Russia would do everything to rid Syria of terrorists. Peskov said that the territory of Syria must be liberated and everything must be done to prevent the country's breakup, which could have catastrophic consequences for the entire region. He also stated that some countries are trying to play with the devil and use terrorists to get rid of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and some just say thoughtlessly that Assad must leave, adding that if Damascus falls and terrorists take hold there will be no political settlement then.
Be the first to know. The news live at the site of the event. Information on events as they are happening. If it's breaking news, it's Nile TV. For ads on Nile TV, Egyptian Radio and Television Union, the economic sector, info@nileinternational.net, or call us on the following numbers.
عايز في البلد دي كل واحد يشتغل بضمير.
كلنا نشتغل، احنا نغير نفسنا بس.
الناس تعامل ضميرها وتعامل مرضي الله.
الناس تبقى كويسه مع بعضيها.
هيبقوا كويسين الناس.
كلنا خير ومصر كلها خير.
هي ام الدنيا، الشعب المصري ده طيب.
لو كل واحد ابتدى بس بنفسه بلد هتتصلح.
كل واحد يعمل ربنا ضميره. الناس تبقى حلوه كده مع الناس.
لازم اخلاق الناس تبقى كويسه، نحب بعض.
الاحترام.
ضماير الناس.
الاخلاق بس.
ان شاء الله ينصلح حالنا بقى.
نتقبل اراء بعض. هي الديمقراطيه، هي الديمقراطيه.
Back. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to welcome here in the studio Dr. Mahmoud Thabit, historian and political analyst. Thank you very much for coming in tonight. Also joining us is engineer Hassan Shaaban, political analyst and former assistant to the chairman of Al-Wafd Party. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let me start off with Dr. Mahmoud. Let me ask you how you evaluate the overall situation of what's happening in Syria today.
I think it's a very serious situation. I think we have at the moment, on the one hand, we're looking at a resistance which the Assad government believe that they can crush, and they haven't been able to. Right. These constant ceasefires that are constantly being broken by the Assad regime is a very good sign of the fact that they seem to think that give them another 2 days and they can break through. It's not happening. They have been given an extra push by the Russian involvement, which came in earlier, and this has sort of brought them to this stage at this time. On the other hand, there are competing interests. I think the most dangerous point of the situation is that there are a number of conflicting and competing interests finding themselves in Aleppo today.
Right.
So that makes a very dangerous situation.
Right.
So really we're facing a situation which is not very easy to calculate. Anything can happen. The Assad regime has shown incredibly bad faith to date. It's not certain that they will show any good faith anytime soon. And at the same time, the international community has not really done very much. and the danger is that they may be provoked to do something more than what they have been.
Right, you mentioned two very important points. A, the role of the international community. Why do you think that they are, I don't want to say uninterested, but sort of lax when it comes to doing anything real tangible in Syria?
Usually, the United States takes the lead, and the European countries follow. We saw this, for example, in Bosnia, where there was a very lukewarm reaction by Europe, and once the United States became involved, it ended the conflict. We've not seen much leadership from the Western powers, from the United States to date. At the same time, the United States is in the midst of an election, and nothing really hard, as far as policy is concerned, is going to happen until a new administration comes into play. And it is very possible that this is a situation that's being taken advantage of at this time to push through what are believed to be final solutions on the situation by the Assad regime, for example.
Okay, if I come to you, Engineer Hassan, and ask you on your take of what's been happening in Syria today and what we're seeing, and obviously the importance of trying to find a solution, or at least abiding by a ceasefire.
Well, the situation is very hairy, actually. I do not think that this bloody scenario will end soon. I think it was meant to be this way, and it will escalate, in my humble opinion. I don't think that the final scene is close, because none of the fighting parties achieved any of the goals really they started to fight for. The Assad is way involved with the Russians, and his national loyalty is not there anymore, actually. He is involved in an international game, and he is like weeds under the legs of elephants. Actually, the Russians will not retreat, the Turks will not retreat, the Kurds will not retreat, the Iranians will not retreat, and Daesh is playing among all these forces, and the ISIS or the Daesh role did not end yet.
Right.
We have to link what's happening in Iraq today, freeing Mosul and leaving the Western Front open to ISIS to flee from Iraq to Syria. This is a very, very big question mark. What's happening? Why not surrounding ISIS in Iraq and finalizing the issue and just get it over with? I find it very strange to see parties that are normally in conflict, like the Kurds and the Turks. They are normally on dispute, but again, they're fighting together, in one trench. I think we did not see the end.
Do you think so, though? Because it seems somehow, when you look at what Turkey is aiming at, or what Turkey, when Turkey fights, it sort of aims at Daesh and the Kurds at the same time, but sort of it seems very shady who it's fighting within Iraq. I mean, to the point that the Iraqi Prime Minister has asked Turkey to leave, and Turkey has refused.
Let me put it this way. Let's try to look at things from a different perspective. Who created ISIS to start with? Who actually gave the equipment, the training, the personnel, the money to ISIS? I don't think that ISIS achieved the goals that they were, created to accomplish. And I don't think ISIS will be wiped out or annihilated in this particular battle. I think somehow there will be a different scenario coming up, and a very scary scenario for ISIS once they are really on the verge of collapse, we will see a very painful and a big threat that ISIS will impose in this particular area, because I have a feeling that somebody wants ISIS, the Islamic State, to survive. Also, I think Turkey wants to push the Kurds out, and if they will have a state, it will not be on Turkish soil. It will be somewhere else. Also, the Turks have certain ambitions in the Iraqi oil around the Mosul area, and you know, the Turks feel that they lost their empire in the Middle East in the wrong time. And once they withdrew to their geographic borders right before the First World War, they feel that they've lost a lot, and they want to regain part of the wealth that they actually lost when they gave up countries like Iraq and Saudi and Kuwait. So I don't think also that the Sunni Shia war really achieved or reached the point of really a huge conflict in the area yet. And this is what certain parties in the West wants to see, a confrontation between Sunni and Shia on massive scale. We did not see this yet. We see it in Yemen. Saudi is spending a hell of a deal of money, and they did not accomplish what they started. Iran is involved in Syria and in Iraq and in Lebanon. And so far, the real war that the West is driving at between the Sunni and the Shia, I think, did not start yet. Something is bound to happen unless the Muslims in the area really realize that they have to be wise and get together and stop this masquerade.
Well, let me take that particular point and put it to Dr. Mahmoud. Do you think that the bigger aim isn't fighting Daesh, isn't particularly a cold war within Syria, but rather this igniting a sectarian war between Sunnis and Shiites?
I mean, I'm not really very persuaded by the grand conspiracy in all this. I believe that people have all blundered into the situation that they all find themselves in today through a series of policy decisions which fundamentally, not all of them, but many of them were completely erroneous. Good indication of this is Daesh in itself. Certainly, some elements of ISIS, Daesh, were helped by Western powers in order to confront the Syrian regime of Assad as supposedly one of the many factions that were militias fighting. So we're going back a few years now. And that this may well be the case, but it certainly blew up in their face. And if anything, these people are a rogue elephant, if you like, and it's not under the control of anyone. We'll see what happens, but I think we should not underestimate the impact that the immigration, because of this war, is happening in Western Europe. Western Europe would like to see an end to this as soon as possible. Thank you very much. It is, after all, creating a lot of problems within their own societies through extremism, through the return of a lot of these foreign fighters into their respective countries. We've seen it, the various terrorist outrages in the last year, frankly. The United States, Frank, I'm not sure is so engaged really at all at this time. They are engaged up to a point, but if you look at the fact that they have confronted Russia, Russia has made them blink. As far as there being a Shia-Sunni civil war, certain elements have been interested in that. We saw that during the early stages of the occupation of Iraq by the United States and its allies, where that conflict is pretty probably was provoked by the Allies in order for the Iraqi citizens to fight each other and not the occupying power. basically, what we have seen since then and subsequent to that is, in essence, these elements which got larger and larger. We should not forget there are certain countries in the Arab Middle East who are not happy with there being a Shia presence in the region. This is also nothing new. There are historical precedents to this. The Roman front, I'm talking about Rome. The frontiers of Rome were on the Euphrates for the simple reason that any power that was on the Iranian plateau would be contained. If the Iranian plateau controlled Iraq, they could power project into the region. And so this has always been a frontier from Iranian influence. It doesn't mean if they're Shia or if they're Sassanids or Zoroastrian, it doesn't matter. It's whoever's there will power project unless they are contained. And this is essentially part of the policy, and it's but one of the indirect causes of the conflict that we see. In my own opinion, I consider a Shia-Sunni conflict as an artificial conflict. And perhaps it's an artificial conflict that disguises the real power politics of today, of various other outside players.
If we look, though, at how many players there are in Syria and Iraq now, we're seeing Turkey, we're seeing Iran, we're seeing other elements, if you will, that the Russians, the Americans, but other elements that are not named but are financing, are not physically involved but are financing. What exactly, I mean, is everyone playing to their own tune? Is everyone wanting their own benefit? Or is there a bigger theory that's going on here?
I think you have a lot of people fighting for their own benefit. They also have their own fears. Their fears are not being respected by their respective allies. I'm specifically here, Turkey, the United States. Turkey and its Kurdish problem within Turkey, Turkey and the Kurds of Syria, and Turkey and the Kurds of the Kurdish Authority. I might add, the Kurdish Authority are actually good friends with the Turkish government. But they are not, the Turks are hostile to the Marxist elements, Marxist militias of Kurds in Syria, which is Kobani, etc., etc. And basically we see a situation where the Turks want to see an end to all this. It's on their frontiers. It's the cause of a massive refugee problem in Turkey. And of course they have their own interests in mind. They don't want to see Shia, Assad, narrow minority in charge of Syria.
Right. If we go on to look at, and I'll come back to you, Engineer Hassan, at the fate of Bashar al-Assad, because there seems to be a lot of people who are suggesting that if Assad goes, this is going to be the perfect scenario. We can have elections that are overseen by the United Nations and sort of, you know, and then picture perfect, everything's going to be solved. But in reality, when we've seen examples where a dictator is brought down, like we've seen in Iraq, like we've seen in Libya, for example, we've seen total chaos in its place. So what do you think is happening when it comes to Assad from the international player's perspective?
I don't think that a fast withdrawal for President Assad will be in favor of the political situation. I think definitely President Assad will have to give up his post sooner or later. I think the history will remember President Assad as a president who actually caused a lot of pain and agony and destruction to his country. Actually, the Alawis are in control of Syria before all of these events took place. They were part of the Shia, group.
Right.
And they are a minority, actually. They're not a majority in Syria. And that was really not a very comfortable situation to the majority of the Syrians, especially in Aleppo. So what's happening today in Aleppo is like a vendetta between the Alawis and the Sunnis in Aleppo. I wrote an article that I know that a lot of people will criticize. There is an absent role to the Arab League. It's obvious. Where is the Arab League if the Arab League did not play a role in a crisis like the Syrian? Or let's concentrate on the Syrian. What else would they do? There is no role to the Arab League. If they did not get involved in this problem, they might as well resolve the Arab League.
How would you have liked to have seen the Arab League play a role?
Actually, when I wrote my article, I said, way back then, there was something called the United Arab Republics.
Right.
That actually included Egypt and Syria and Libya. And there is a constitution that we actually voted, all of the three countries voted to this constitution, and it is still applicable. And our President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, actually using a palace called Al-Ittihadiyya, which is actually the palace that was allocated to this, United Arab government.
Right.
So actually, I would actually increase the presence of Egypt, because I know, as much as we love Syrians, they are our brothers, and we are the most suitable country to get involved in this.
Well, we are getting involved, and let me ask Dr. Mahmoud about Egypt's recent role. Obviously, it didn't please everyone, especially the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, when we voted for the resolutions on the UN Security Council. But what did you make of the latest statements made by the Foreign Minister with regards to a new resolution that includes Egypt, Spain and New Zealand?
Well, I think Egypt has chosen to play the role of being on the side of the humanitarian element in all this, right. And it's gone too far. We're looking, I mean, this recent bombing of Aleppo is considered to be the new Guernica. It's gone too far, all this. And if Egypt can play a role to start diffusing the situation without necessarily remaining a neutral party, in as much as not taking a particular side at this time, I think it is a wise choice. It's a wise way of going forward. But I agree that the idea of the Arab League has not been applied. The Arab League has been, ever since the first Gulf War, the Arab League became a toothless organization. And even before that, taken any action about anything. And I think it really is time that the Arab League take positive and proactive measures in the politics of the region.
I mean, some would argue, what kind of measures can the Arab League take if it has no Arab army, for example?
Well, obviously, one has to form an Arab army.
But I mean, obviously,
well, I think they better get on with it. I don't know what they're waiting for.
There was then the counter argument of starting an Islamic or an army under the OIC. So it seems very.
You mean versus the Arab League army? Or?
We're not quite certain what's happening.
Okay. Well, all I can say is the founder of the Arab League, Abdurrahman Azzam, always said that the Arab League was a Muslim league with an Arab label. Right. It incorporated both. Right. And I think that's not all that different nowadays anyway. I'm not saying it's a OIC, but it's certainly one that represents the Arab countries, whose majority happen to be Muslim today. And the Arab League, at least at that time, found formulas for unity, which are formulas which have been unraveled today.
Right next door is a lot happening also in Iraq, where forces are trying to push back Daesh militants from Mosul. Let's take a look at the following report and then come back to continue our discussion.
Iraqi army troops on Saturday stormed into a Christian region that has been under Daesh terrorists' control since 2014 as part of U.S.-backed operations to clear the entrances to Mosul, the militants' last major city stronghold in Iraq. The advance took place as U.S. Defense Secretary Ash Carter arrived on a visit to Baghdad to meet Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi and assess the campaign that started on Monday with air and ground support from the U.S.-led coalition. A military statement said Iraqi units entered the center of Karakosh, a mainly Christian town, about 20 kilometers southeast of Mosul, and were carrying out mop-up operations across the town. Further action was underway to seize a neighboring Christian village, Carmeles. The region's population fled in the summer of 2015. Daesh terrorists swept in. Earlier this week, Iraqi special units also captured Bartel, a Christian village north of Karakosh. U.S. military officials estimated there were fewer than a couple of hundred Daesh terrorists in Karakosh. The offensive on Mosul is expected to become the biggest battle fought in Iraq since the U.S.-led invasion in 2003. The army is also trying to advance from the south and the east, while Kurdish Shmerga fighters are holding fronts in the east and north. U.S. forces at Iraq's Qayyara West airfield south of Mosul put on protective masks after winds brought fumes from a nearby sulfur plant set alight by Daesh terrorists. The militants retaliated to the advance of the Iraqi forces and the Kurdish fighters in Mosul by attacking on Friday Kirkuk, an oil city that lies east, Hawija, a pocket they continue control between Baghdad and Mosul. Authorities in Kirkuk regained control of the city on Saturday and partially lifted the curfew declared after the militants stormed police stations and other buildings. The region's oil-producing facilities were not damaged. At least 50 people have been killed and 80 others wounded in clashes between security forces and the militants in Kirkuk, according to a hospital sources.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Continuing on with our discussion, Engineer Hassan, let me come back to you. Obviously, we've just heard that U.S. Defense Chief Ashton Carter said that an operation to isolate Daesh in Syria's Raqqa should begin in conjunction with an assault on the insurgents' Iraqi bastion in Mosul. Does that sort of... is it similar to the suggestion that you made about encircling rather than just pushing back the terrorists?
I have a lot of doubts that this could happen because this really will, surround ISIS in Syria, and it will surround ISIS in Iraq. And I still think that the Frankenstein that the U.S. created did not really play the role yet required. I think I would like to add something to what Mr. Mahmoud said. Everybody is playing to his own interest. I would like to say that a country like Qatar is putting money like hell in Syria because they want to have a pipeline, a gas pipeline, go across the north of Syria all the way to Turkey and, bypass the gas pipelines that the Russians are, using to provide Europe with gas. It's an economical war again. It looks like a religious or a political, but really it is an economical war. A lot of things are happening. I hope really that Mr. Ashton is, leveling with us. And if this takes place, this is the beginning of the end for ISIS. Because if you actually surround ISIS in Iraq and surround ISIS in Syria in two pockets, it will be very easy for everybody to annihilate them. Right. But is this required really? Putting in mind that like 6 months ago, the personnel who actually formed ISIS were crossing borders from Turkey.
Right.
And are you really surrounding ISIS in Syria and Iraq right away and you're really serious, or you're allowing a little open in the door to let ISIS flee from Turkey all the way to Libya to start a problem to somebody else.
Right.
I mean, it's all actually connected, and we all should be very aware of the role that ISIS is playing. It's like a ghost that appears in Iraq, and suddenly it appears in Syria, and suddenly it disappears and appears in Libya. There is a maestro behind all that. And Egypt should be very aware, if we are Egyptians and we're talking in an Egyptian TV, we should be very aware, and we will not trust any move that anybody makes, because we've learned from history that really what appears to be a good faith is not really a very sincere thing toward the area. I think also, I don't think that the awful scenario that the Saudis will face have started yet, because I have a feeling that somehow somebody will turn the table suddenly, and Saudi itself will have problems. The bad scenario of dividing Saudi that we've all read about and heard of, this did not start yet. Saudi is engaged in fighting in Yemen. Saudi is financing the war in Syria. I think suddenly the Saudis are playing a positive role in the area, whether it is to the good of the area or not, but suddenly the Saudis are involved in so many, they have their fingers in the pie. So actually, I don't think what we see in the area is close to end. I think we're going to have, we're going to have to face the music. I think.
Let's look at what's happening in Iraq in particular. Now, Dr. Mahmoud, we're seeing obviously the operation to liberate Mosul happening currently, but again, there is this notion that you're pushing back the Daesh terrorists, and again, there's always the question as to where do they go when you push them back. So how do you evaluate the overall situation when it comes to liberating Mosul? Do you think that the Iraqi government, that the Iraqi troops have the upper hand there? And obviously, if you could also tell us where you think these Daesh militants go.
Well, I think we know that many Daesh militants have been evacuating Mosul, were able to get out of Mosul before it was surrounded. It is effectively surrounded now. When we say surrounded, we're looking at the fact that it's under constant surveillance. Anything that moves is hit by airstrikes. There is quite an impressive military force that has surrounded, made up, incidentally, of a number of sources, militias, official army, the Peshmerga, who are the Iraqi. There are even 2,000 Turks, for example, Turkish military, in addition to which there are Turks who are being supported, rather militias being supported by the Turks. You have the Western countries have contingents of special forces. It's quite a substantial thing going on at this point. You also, I might add, have the thing that has been very dangerous in all this are the Shia militias. What the Iraqi government has been trying to avoid saying or avoid showing is that it is a Sunni Shia civil war. And it really isn't, but it could easily be dragged into one.
Right.
And essentially the Shia militias have misbehaved in other places that they've taken and have committed many atrocities.
Right.
So one has to be very careful as to what will happen after. But certainly Daesh in Iraq, in northern Iraq, have been cornered.
Right.
And now it is just a question of time.
Right.
Will it collapse? Will they have to fight for it house to house? Both are very possible. A lot of the senior, we are told, a lot of the senior officials and senior leadership is not in Mosul anymore and actually evacuated some time ago.
It's interesting you mention, obviously, the Shiite militias, because some analysts have also pointed out that the Shiite militias could take advantage of what's happening in Mosul, and that Daesh is being pushed back to start or to try and take over themselves the area of Mosul and sort of create a demographic change in their own interests. Do you think that that is a possibility?
Well, they may well try, but they're going to have all sorts of other elements who are going to be pushing back very hard, including the Kurds, I might add. And the Kurds, the contingent of the Kurdish forces that are involved in this is quite substantial, much larger than the Shia militias. It's not a little thing.
Perhaps I didn't take your take on Turkey's involvement, because now we're seeing a war of words between Turkey and the Iraqi Prime Minister, who has said that Turkey's presence in Iraq is not welcome, and Turkey insisting that it will stay. Now, how do you see really Turkey's insistence on staying? And the international community isn't really reacting at all, because this is undermining Iraqi sovereignty.
Up to a point, but Iraqi sovereignty has mistreated the Sunni minority in Iraq. No one has stood up for the Sunni minority. The Turks have stood up for the Sunni minority. That is the role they're playing. They're saying, we are actually, no one else is protecting them. We are going to be the ones putting ourselves in a position to be the protectors of the Sunni minority, which has been mistreated by the Shia majority government, which has been in place since the war and since the Allied occupation of Iraq. And I think that's the role they're playing, essentially.
I'd like to add something to what Mr. Mahmoud said. I think the Turks and the Saudis are sharing the responsibility. You see, the Saudis are very much involved in Syria, and for a strategic, I have this feeling, that they allowed the Turks to get into north of Iraq to play the same role that they played, the Saudis played in Syria. So. And I think the Saudis gave guarantees to the Turks that they guaranteed that the Arab League would not protest the Turkish involvement in Iraq because they're protecting the Sunnis. So actually, we see a very hairy situation where, things could, suddenly change. Kurds are fighting with the Turks against the ISIS or the Shias. This is why I said in the beginning, we did not see yet the Sunni Shias war start yet on a massive scale. So it's a very complicated.
Do you think that's something, obviously, that Dr. Mahmoud mentioned earlier? Right now, the US really isn't playing much of a role because of its waiting for its new president, if you will. Let me ask you, do you think it matters who is president of the United States?
My experience with the US is a very long experience. No matter who gets into the White House will comply with the national security policy that they draw in the Pentagon and behind closed doors. The president will have very little say to change what's happening on the ground. The U.S. wants full control of the area, and the area contains a lot of wealth that cannot be ignored. A lot of the countries in the area got very wealthy beyond reason, in their opinion, and this will have to be skimmed. They have to skim some of this money into armament and into wars.
Well, because I've only got 3 minutes left, let me ask if Dr. Mahmoud shares the same point of view. Do you think that it really matters who is the next US president when it comes to the policy in the Middle East?
There is a fundamental policy, obviously, but the leadership will change that policy. It'll either be very proactive, it'll either be very tough, or it'll take a very hard line, or it'll take a soft line on whatever that policy is. a little wary of the idea that the policy has already been set and that a president just follows that policy that has been set in the past. I think certainly the president has, if he knows what he's doing, certainly has the ability to modify that policy in the way that he feels his administration should be taking. Right. We have seen the fact that the Obama administration did not seem to have a particular policy. They followed an existing policy, but followed it in a way that was the Obama administration's take on that policy, right, which turned out very, very soft and frankly, no real decisions were made. Really, they were sort of things that went in one direction or the other.
All right. Well, gentlemen, I thank you very much for your time. Dr. Mahmoud Thabit, historian and political analyst. It was a pleasure having you with us. Engineer Hassan Shaban, always a pleasure having you with us. Political analyst and former assistant to the chairman of Al-Wafd Party. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all the time we have for this edition of the Daily Debate. Tomorrow, a new group and a new presenter. Monal Salhi comes your way then. Until then, it's goodbye.